Welcome to Cultural Appreciation versus Appropriation, Misappropriation, the third in a series of 6 webinars entitled Working Towards Right Relationship with Indigenous Peoples. Before I introduce all of our panelists and address some logistical issues, I would like to introduce you to Dan and Mary Lou Smoke to open our evening together. Dan is a member of the Seneca Nation, and Mary Lou is a member of the Ojibwe Nation. They're coming to us from London, Ontario, in what is now Canada. Please welcome them as we center in a spirit of gratitude and expectant waiting on Spirit to lead us. Dan and Mary Lou.
My name is Shooting Star Woman. I'm Bear Clan, and I originally come from Batchewana Bay, Ontario, which is on beautiful Lake Superior. And I'm very honored to be here to share some of the teachings that I've learned throughout my lifetime.
Yes, and I'm Seneca Nation. I'm a member of the Kildare clan. I was born in Onondaga, down in near Nedro, where Frida's from. And I'm a member of the Six Nations Grand River Territory. I'd just like to open up with the Thanksgiving address. These are the words that are said before all others. We try to always begin our circles, our ceremonies, our coming together for any acknowledgement that whenever we speak to the natural world, we always try to begin in this way. So Niawe, Sagwaudizo, Senion, Esquatahas, Kitkontanoa, Gohase, Jawise Dodakwa, Oskada Nagohas, Oida, Anahas. Grandfather, grandmother, hear our sacred thoughts, hear our sacred prayers as we bring our good minds and our good intentions into the circle this evening. We want to acknowledge this beautiful Wani Sleo that we've been blessed with today in a good way. And as we come together, we want to give greetings and give thanks to the water. The water is that feminine, sacred element of life that all creation needs in order to survive. And the water is still following her sacred instructions. All the life that lives in the water, all the life that lives on the water, continue to take care of the water. So we give greetings, give thanks that the water is still following her sacred instructions. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. We want to also give greetings, give thanks to our Mother Earth, all the life that lives in Mother Earth, all the life that lives on Mother Earth, the crawlers, the four-leggeds, the two-leggeds, the plants, the medicines, the rocks, the minerals, the trees, all the life that lives in the trees, and all the life that lives on the trees, the flyers. For all this creation is taking care of our Mother the Earth. It is an interconnected, interrelated, interdependent life support system that continues to do this to this day, so that our Mother the Earth is still following her sacred instructions. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. We give greetings, we give thanks to our Father Sky. Our Father Sky represents the air, and our Father Sky continues to breathe that life into all creation. So we want to give acknowledgement that our Father Sky is still following his sacred instructions. Nothing would survive without our Father Sky. Nothing would survive without our Mother Earth. Nothing would survive without the water. So we want to acknowledge that, grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. We want to also acknowledge our eldest brother, the sun. Our eldest brother, the sun, represents fire. Our eldest brother travels across the sky every day from the eastern door to the western door. He is going to be setting soon if he hasn't already. We want to acknowledge that as he shows his face on his journey across the sky, he always brings forth light, and he always brings forth heat. So we acknowledge that our Father Sky is still doing that. So we acknowledge that our Father Sky is still following his sacred instructions. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. We also want to acknowledge, grandfather, grandmother, the grandmother moon. This time we are in the time of the Mendaman Gizes, the corn moon, and the grandmother moon continues to look after all female life. She continues to look after the water. She continues to purify and recycle the water, for she is still following her sacred instructions, grandfather, grandmother, and we acknowledge the corn the corn that we are celebrating right now, the harvest of the green corn. So in many of our lodges, in many of our longhouses, in many of our roundhouses, we will be conducting our green corn ceremonies, grandfather, grandmother, so be it, in our minds. We also want to acknowledge our star relatives who remind us when it is time for us to conduct our ceremonies of Thanksgiving. We always know when it is time because we watch the stars, and the stars tell us the time for us to conduct these ceremonies. So we give greetings, give thanks that the stars are still following their sacred instructions, and nothing would survive without the stars. Nothing would survive without our grandmother moon, grandfather, grandmother, so be it, in our minds. We also want to acknowledge the thunder beings whose job it was to wake up and shake up the earth back in February, March. That time is when the new cycle of creation was about to begin. So it was necessary for our thunder beings to wake up and shake up the earth. Everything came awake, everything came alive. So we want to acknowledge that the thunder beings are still following their sacred instructions. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it, in our minds. We also want to acknowledge, grandfather, grandmother, the four protectors. The four protectors are those four celestial beings who look after all spiritual matters. It is they who work with our own spirit helpers. We each have our own spirit helpers. Our spirit helpers guide us and show us a good way. They are always there whenever we need. And so we acknowledge that the spirit helpers are still following their sacred instructions. And we acknowledge that the four protectors are still working with Saguanodizo, Dijeminado, and helping us to be guided and to walk in a good way. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it, in our minds. And lastly, we acknowledge Saguanodizo, the maker of our bodies. The maker of our bodies has put everything here that we need in order to survive. There's nothing here that we don't need, and everything ensures our survival and our livelihood. So we want to acknowledge that Saguanodizo, we give thanks and we give greetings on a daily basis, beginning with our sunrise ceremony, going all the way to our full moon ceremony. We want to acknowledge that we are always acknowledging our gratitude. So in the spirit of our ancestors, we want to say, Miigwech, Miawe, all my relations, Daneto, hi hi.
Tucker Watson.
Oh.
Thank you so much,
Oh.
Dan and Mary Lou. I'd also like to offer thanks to our co-sponsors this evening, Canadian Friends Service Committee, Decolonizing Quakers, and Towards Right Relationship with Native Peoples program of the Friends Peace Teams. And thank the members of the Planning Committee and the Pendle Hill staff. In particular, I would like to thank Francisco Burgos, who is our person who is producing this behind the scenes and is our tech guru and Zoom maven. I have a few reminders for folks. All of the participants this evening, except for the panelists and me, your moderator, are muted, and you will not be able to unmute yourself. If you encounter problems, please use the chat feature on the Zoom screen to inform Francisco of your problems. As questions may arise this evening, you are invited to write them in chat and send them to Francisco. All chat messages will actually go only to our host, Francisco. You will not be able to chat with other participants that you happen to notice on in the guest view. A reminder that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to registrants at some time in the future after it has been reviewed and edited as necessary. Registrants will be notified when the recording becomes available, so you don't need to write to us and ask when it will become available. You will receive an e-blast from me. I'm usually sending those out on Thursday evenings every week. to let people know what the connection is for the upcoming webinar, information about our speakers, and so forth. There will be 2 opportunities during the course of the series for participants to gather together for discussion in small groups via Zoom. And one of those will be next Monday, September 21st, for 1 hour, beginning at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And I will be sending out an email e-blast in this coming week that is entitled Pendle Hill Webinar Information, as all of my e-blasts are entitled Pendle Hill Webinar Information, later this week, that'll contain information on how to connect to Zoom that evening and other updates on our program. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's panelists. Dan and Mary Lou Smoke. For over 30 years, the Smokes have co-hosted a nationally acclaimed and award-winning Indigenous radio program called Smoke Signals, broadcast from Western University in Ontario, where Dan is an adjunct professor. Mary Lou is a gifted writer, singer, guitarist, and traditional drummer. Together, they have been cultural counselors and visiting elders for colleges, universities, agencies, and service providing organizations. I should mention that I'm giving quite abbreviated introductions to our panelists this evening. Full biographical information or fuller biographical information is available on our Working Toward Right Relationship page on our website. Frida Jacques is a clan mother of the Turtle Clan of the Onondaga Nation, where she lives and which she has served for over 40 years. As a New York humanities scholar, Frida has helped bring Onondaga culture to educational institutions, libraries, and other organizations. She helped develop the script for the Scanal Great Law of Peace Center, which teaches others about Onondaga culture, including the importance of all humanity understanding that they depend on the natural world. She also works with neighbors of the Onondaga Nation. Reverend Dr. J.R. Norwood is a principal justice of the Tribal Supreme Court of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, which he has also served as a council member for many years. He is co-chair of the Task Force on Federal Acknowledgement of the National Congress of American Indians and the General Secretary of the Alliance of Colonial Era Tribes. Also, for over 28 years, he has been pastor of Ujima Christian Church of Ewing, New Jersey, a non-tribal independent Reform congregation. Trinity Norwood is the youngest member of our panel, who, in addition to being the daughter of Pastor and Tanya Norwood, is an advocate for Indigenous peoples working to promote and educate about Indigenous issues through different media, including art, film, and literature. She is the founder of Native New Jersey, a nonprofit seeking to spread awareness, dispel stereotypes and misconceptions about Native people, educating both teachers and students alike about Indigenous issues. Welcome, panelists. We're so glad that you're with us tonight. I would like to start by turning to some of the questions that people have submitted in response to the invitation that I sent out last week. And I think focusing on our opening ceremony to some extent, and acknowledging that Unitarian Universalists and Quakers, at least those in the Universalist branches of Quakerism, are believe in the unity of all spiritual practices, as in there being many roads to the one. And we have, I think, a provocative question to those of you, the Smokes and Pastor Norwood and Frida, all of whom are cultural ambassadors to non-native peoples. We have a question from a Unitarian Universalist minister who says, one of the principles of Unitarian Universalism is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And that principle has Unitarian Universalists in a kind of syncretic way, pulling from various traditions in their, for their sermons and in their religious education. So the question that our friend raises is, of course, a UU will tell you that we are not doing a powwow or smoking a peace pipe or wearing beads. But my question is that I feel even using indigenous stories to educate our children about the interdependent web of existence may be appropriating. How do we draw that line? Frida?
Yes. What we'd like is people to recognize that we're all dependent on the natural world working as it should. So in order to help people appreciate that and realize it on a deep level, this is why we don't mind people letting people know that they're independent and interdependent on all the things that Creator has done. And really, there isn't anything that humans do that the earth can't do without. So all we do as humans, we are people who use everything. We depend on everything. You know, we breathe the air, we drink the water, we need the water, we have the medicines, we need the medicines, we need all of it to work as it does in order to survive. So helping people realize that is an important thing, because a lot of the damage that has happened over time is because people did not have respect for the water, did not have respect for the critters, you know, that run wild. They don't have respect for so many parts of creation that there's this ongoing destruction. So I'm happy when people stop and recognize that this is an appreciation we appreciate. Appropriation would be someone trying to do exactly Thanksgiving address, you know, actually trying to do the ceremony in our language maybe. That would be misappropriation. But we want people to appreciate and love and respect all those parts of creation that do their duty every day. And it's our duty as humans, and it makes sense that it is, to be thankful.
Would it be appropriate, for example, for in the Sunday school of the Unitarian Church or in the First Day School of Quaker Meeting, for the teacher to read the Thanksgiving address in English, explaining that it is that which begins every day in Onondaga country and throughout the Haudenosaunee Nation? Is that appropriation? I think part of it comes from telling the stories that that this particular person is concerned with. And it could be answered by others as well as Frida. Or Frida.
I have no problem with that myself, because they're reading it in English and it's been written by a Native people for that purpose, to share the Thanksgiving address so that people understand it, so people can feel that Thanksgiving right from Mother Earth on up into the sky. So I don't have a problem with that. And I think it's probably a good idea, especially in this time of the world when we're in trouble. You know, the earth is in trouble.
Thank you. I would like to turn to the question that was initially posed by Pastor Norwood for a discussion, and I'm going to rephrase it as, what do you see as the difference between cultural appreciation, appropriation, and misappropriation? The question we're dealing with all throughout this evening is recognizing what is offensive and what can count as supportive of and lifting up in respectful ways indigenous cultures, I should say. Pastor Norwood?
Yeah, I have often differentiated between appropriation and misappropriation because every culture in one way or another appropriates something from other cultures that it's near or around or influenced by. And that's just a historic fact. There are many words in native languages that actually are borrowed from other native languages and have even been borrowed sometimes from European languages. Those of us who have, or our tribes of first contact, have words that we use that actually came to us in colonial days. So every culture appropriates, but the issue is whether it's appropriate appropriation or misappropriation. I think that for the example, in the vocabulary issue, that was a matter of communication, and it was necessary. No lines were being crossed. When you get to the point of ceremonies, where you get to the point of sacred items, regalia, certain cultural practices, then you're getting to the point of misappropriating, because if a person is assuming the right to utilize these things, and sometimes even mixing and matching elements from different native cultures that don't really go together, that's where you have the problem. Appreciation, from my perspective, would be like Frida had said before me, the accepting and the promoting of values. I have yet to find Native people who have a problem with non-natives embracing our values in regard to our respect for nature, our respect for one another, our respect for our ancestors, and the concept of a legacy that we have to carry forward in a good way to future generations. These are values that every human being should have. And we have no problem having people who are not indigenous cite our values and promote them. That's a wonderful thing. Where the line is, and I think it was expressed well by Frida, is that it's one thing to say this is a native story, if it really is, because there's a lot of stories out there that aren't, that are claiming to be. But it's one thing to say that this story was used by this tribe or that tribe to teach this lesson. And it's another thing to perpetuate a false story and say it's part of native culture, or mix and match stories from different tribes and act as though it's an ancient story. That's where the line is, in my opinion. And when you assume the right to do ceremonies in a tribal area where that region's tribe has a problem with non-natives doing those ceremonies or wearing regalia that sometimes is specific to a tribe or a clan or even a family, some elements of regalia that have to be earned or are ceremonial, that's where we cross the line into misappropriation.
Thank you. Other comments on that? I thought that helped me a lot. Other panelists care to speak to that issue? If not, I can move on to the next question, which I think builds right into what you were talking about. Frida, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to add just a smidge on about the Thanksgiving. When the Thanksgiving is done by our people, it's done in our languages. And that person who's chosen to do the, I'm gonna hand you the Thanksgiving, does it from the heart. So even though there's something to read now and we can share, the normal way would be that person would just speak it out. You know, he would give his an address, and he might mention how he saw a deer with 2 fawns, or he saw a turtle along the way, and when he was walking near the river, he could speak about anything along the way. So it can be very long. So it doesn't have to be as short as you've seen it written, and it usually isn't. So I just wanted people to know that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Pastor Norwood has brought us to another question that I know is on the minds of any number of Quakers. In years past, Quaker youth experienced sweat lodges were performed at Friends General Conference summer gatherings, and many of them found it a very meaningful group experience. At one point, well, the sweat lodge was being mentored by a non-Indigenous person who was, according to the questioner, specifically trained in the sweat lodge and commissioned, I'm using that word, to bring it among non-Indigenous peoples, I believe by a Lakota person. However, when this was going to be held at a gathering that moves around the country in an area of Massachusetts, the local Indigenous people in the area felt this was an unjustified appropriation of their sacred practices. The question arises from either difference among different tribal nations as to what it is appropriate for non-natives to do, but this would definitely be in the form of a ceremony. And I would welcome your comments about apparently at least the Lakota person who instructed the friend in this method and in the
I don't mean
go
to
ahead.
jump
I don't
in
think
again.
I need to elaborate anymore. I think it's known to many of the Quakers on the call, at least. And so
there are so many individuals who assume the right to do ceremonies and say that they were taught or authorized by someone. And what they don't realize is that for many tribal cultures, ceremonies are owned by the community. And the individuals who practice them are authorized by the community or that particular clan or a particular family within a clan. And it's not necessarily the right of any one individual to pass it on. Now, within Lakota culture, this may be different. But if they're in territory, and based on what you were saying, they're in the Northeast, which is not a Lakota area, the tribes that are indigenous to that region should be respected. That would be a violation from their perspective in their territory. I also know that in many instances, people will say that they're authorized to teach something and have someone pass it on, and they really haven't been by their community. And I can't speak for the Lakota. I don't know if that is something that is done there, but it is something that, from my own experience, would be frowned on from my community. And we have others that are from the Northeast on the phone that, on the call that could comment from theirs.
Thank you, Pastor Norwood. Dan and Mary Lou, have you any ideas on this?
Yes. I would just like to add in concurrence with Reverend Norwood that when you travel into another nation's territory, you respect the ways of that territory, the ways of the people who come from that territory. So you do things according to their ways. And I know that my upbringing, I traveled to a place, Akwesasne, a Mohawk community, and there I got to travel with the White Roots of Peace, which was a communications group that traveled out of the Mohawk Nation House, where they produced a newspaper called Akwesasne Notes. And this communications group was the White Roots of Peace that traveled around to colleges, universities, reserves, prisons, friendship centers, etc. And so we had a couple of Lakota people amongst our group. It was probably about 20 of us, and I would say maybe 8 or 9 of us were Haudenosaunee, and the rest were members from Hopi, Navajo, Wailiki from the West Coast, Lakota. And so we kind of shared our different ways because it had already been established prior to my arrival that when we were out on the road, we would often travel into different nations' territories. And whenever we were in the territory of the Lakota, the Lakota participants would welcome us and invite us to a purification sweat lodge ceremony. So that was the first time that I ever got to experience it. And I was only 19 years old at the time. So I really had a great experience, I think similar to the young Quaker boys, but I knew that it was not a part of the Haudenosaunee way until I started doing some research and I found out that we did do something similar a long time ago. But amongst the Lakota, they do that on a regular basis. So I was very happy to marry a Lakota. Mary Lou's part Lakota, and so she, amongst her people, they performed this, and so we began to perform it together. And we were taught by a Lakota Sundance chief, holy man, and we were taught by a Cree elder. Plus, we were a number of other elders that we apprenticed with. And so it was a long tutelage that we went through, the journey that we went through to learn how to conduct ceremonies properly. Because when we conduct a ceremony, we are responsible for the mental health and well-being of everyone in the ceremony. So we have to be very conscious of this. So their mental, physical, social, spiritual, emotional well-being is tantamount to ensuring a good ceremony. So we took that very seriously before we started doing our own purification sweat lodge ceremonies. But once we started doing them, we were told by one of our elders, an Ojibwe elder from Red Lake, Minnesota. He said, "You build a lodge for the men, and you build a lodge for the women, and you don't really have to say anything because they will come. They will come. People will come and want to participate and join you." And that was in fact the reality that we experienced. So we've learned that yeah, we have to be very careful when doing ceremonies, especially those kinds of ceremonies, because they are quite involved. There's quite a lot of preparation. There's a lot of like we always begin with tobacco. Tobacco is our medium. It's our way of asking for permission, asking for help. And then when we've concluded, we give thanks with our tobacco. So we always begin and end with the tobacco. That has been my teaching from the Haudenosaunee way of doing things. So we always respected that, our own ways. And we found that it was pretty common for both of us that we learned as much as the participants were learning, because they were bringing in some of their own stories, some of their own teachings, and sharing them with the rest of us. And that was always very a good way of learning about another one's culture, because you never know when it's dark inside and all you have is like an ashen air and you can't see anything. All you hear is their spirit talking. All you hear is their voice. And when you hear these voices, it's quite amazing. It's quite beautiful. It's quite spiritual.
Thank you, Dan. Quick question on that. When you were describing this, though, this is entirely among different members of a Native community. Is that correct? Different.
Yes. Yes. But more and more, it's not so homogenized anymore. It's quite mixed. Anytime we gather together for example, a healing circle, talking circle, sundance ceremony, shaking tent ceremony, purification sweat lodge ceremony, we always attract a lot of people who are looking for answers for themselves, even though it may not come from their culture.
Is it including non-natives?
Oh, yes. Yes, non-natives can come as long as they bring their tobacco and they bring their respect, that they're going to honor and respect what they learn and what they hear and not try to commodify it, for example.
That brings up a very good point. One of the notes that was on our resource list was occurred in Canada, what is now called Canada, and it was a non-native person who was selling certification to become an Indigenous healer to all comers. And I think that the number of First Nations and members of the larger Indigenous population, including the Métis, were opposed this, and strongly so, and this ceased to be, this woman ceased to do that. So obviously it would be inappropriate for a non-native person to claim authority to perform native ceremonies, and certainly to commodify them by selling some kind of certification by taking lessons from a non-native person to be a native healer. I think all could agree on that, yes?
Yes. Yes, John.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I think we're brought up to another another question that has arisen is about land acknowledgement. How our panelists disposed? It has become more frequent among Quaker organizations and others to post on their website to open their conferences and workshops by acknowledging the land upon the original inhabitants of the land on which the conference is being held, or the organization is occupying at this time. Both, is that something that, is it appropriate for an organization to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples originally on the lands that the organization is located on? Is this only acceptable if it's being done by tribal members? And how, it's only a part of what folks are engaged in at the moment, but it does seem to be a first step that some non-native directed organizations, or largely non-native organizations, are undertaking. Thoughts from Trinity?
Oh, Miss Frida, feel free to speak first.
We always give it to elders first, but our practice is to some extent also to hear all voices. But Frida, please go first, and Trinity, do come in.
Actually, we had an organization here in Central New York, the Native American Consortium, Central New York Consortium, and it was several different schools within the Central New York area. it was our point to encourage all of the schools to do land acknowledgement. And it was intended for the people who are in the schools to recognize where they are and give recognition and respect to the people and lands that they were sitting on and appreciating. So it's always been, at least from my point of view, intended to have folks out there recognize where they are and respect it and recognize it. It was not something, I know I was asked by someone from the Senecas, you know, if they themselves were going to do it, and they were going to ask that someone was asking them to do it. That's not cool. I mean, it should be from the people who are appreciating where they are. They should say it. And so the other people in the audience will know where they are and whose land they're sitting on. This is the reason we encouraged it. And here in Central New York, almost all of the consortium schools, and there's like, I believe 7, are doing that now, and which is a good thing. And I know it's traveled, the idea has traveled, and I don't know if it started here or not. All I know is that I was a part of it in this area, and the intention was that.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Trinity, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that land acknowledgements are extremely important. I also think that it changes it's a small seed that's planted that changes the mindset of the people in the room. It changes the mindset from I'm here doing this and this is about me and how I'm interacting, to a larger view of this is the land. There are people who have lived on this land in harmony with this land for hundreds and hundreds of years before I was here. And I need to enter this space in a different type of way. So I have gotten more and more requests for land acknowledgements within the past year. And I think it's a wonderful step. I also think that there is great importance in the people at that event or part of that organization doing a land acknowledgement. I often find myself trying to toe the line of participating and assisting, and also satisfying someone's idea of what an Indigenous person is. You know, I am here as an Indigenous person, but I'm not waiting around to be Indigenous for you. You know, you can write it, you can ask for questions, you can ask questions about a land acknowledgement, you can ask for references, but it is not my job to make you and your organization feel good by driving an hour out to your event to give you a land acknowledgement for 5 minutes so you feel good about yourself. It is an obligation that I think we all should have. It is important for you to reach out to the keepers of that land where you are on to ensure that you are doing it the right way. There's also a difference between a land acknowledgement and blessing the land, which is a ceremonial act, which should be done by the Indigenous people of that land.
Thank you very much. I think both those helped a great deal. Anybody else from the panel feel the need to address that further, or can we move to another question?
I would just like to quickly add, when we started our radio broadcast 30 years ago, we used to ask amongst ourselves in the radio banter between Mary Lou and I on the air, we would say, I wonder if people know in the city here, City of London, in the Great Lakes watershed, who the original people were that lived here. I wonder if they know. I bet you they don't even know. And so it took like 15 years, 16 years, 17 years before people started to know who the original inhabitants of and who settled that particular territory. I was really happy to see the Maori filmmaker of the film Jojo Starbuck acknowledged Jojo Rabbit, sorry, when he acknowledged the land territory upon which the Hollywood awards were being handed out. I was really pleasantly surprised to see that. But it's starting to happen where, you know, people are being educated. It is a form of education. It's and I think it's very vital that people know this information. And you know, so it's happening more and more. And I agree with with Trinity about how it should be them doing the land acknowledgement. I mean, we shouldn't have to, like she says, drive an hour, give 5 minutes of land acknowledgement, and then make them look good. I don't, right. She's right about that.
I agree. I think it's an important time where the history can be shared, because the true history that happened on Turtle Island is not out there. And so we have this opportunity where we can share what really happened. When I was 8 years old, I hated history. That year we went to school in Toronto because my mom was sick, and I was the only Native kid in the class. And we learned about the Mohawks massacring some white people up on the St. Lawrence River. And I got chased home from school. And I went running in the house, and my mom says, "Mary Lou, what's wrong?" And I told her what happened. And she goes, "Mary Lou, you get right back out there and you tell them that this is our land. We never gave it up." So ever since I was 8 years old, I've been speaking up for our people and telling them the history that I've learned. And I still hated history until I started learning the history of our people, the people in this area. I started learning about, migration around here. The Senecas and the Ojibways, I'm mostly Ojibwe, they lived amongst each other around this way, and I'm pretty sure Dan and I were in another life together. But I think it's really important to get the true history out there and to get rid of the Black history, the dark history that's in the history books. We have so many Native scholars now that we can do that. And I see it, it's starting to get done, but it's a big job. So we have to keep at it and keep going.
Thank you. Yes, yes, indeed. I just a brief footnote there. Last webinar, we were encouraged by Chief Coker and our two presenters to look at where we are living, working, worshiping, where our organizations are located, to educate ourselves as non-Native people about the history of the land and the people who occupied it. And there was a resource that I sent out, which I would say is not dispositive. And in fact, it's probably, I would say, is only a place to begin. But in the e-blast that I sent out to everyone, there is a resource with an interactive world map to identify the original inhabitants of various territories. And of course, as Mary Lou was just alluding to, as various tribes were forced off the land or moved from the land or removed from the land, they met up with other tribal nations and had various relations, lived with those peoples to whom they had, onto whose land they had moved. And so it's a more complicated story than perhaps the map would lead you to believe, but it is at least a starting point. And I have learned to love history because of the different perspectives that I'm getting. Thanks so much. A question that I think we might move to next is artifacts and so forth. This is one that I think is where appreciation and appropriation can be helpful also. One person has mentioned, I have a wood sculpture entitled Think Hole. It was created by a white woman. A think hole was dug by Wampanoag natives to memorialize an event. Is this cultural misappropriation?
I'm not sure what the question is. So a non-native created a sculpture and gave it and named it after something that also is a name natives use? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, a think hole. That was the question that was posed. I don't have
Right.
more elaboration on it, but let's start with the idea. Suppose there is a a non-native person has created something that they refer to as a dream catcher, for example, and then sell it as a dream catcher.
I think that when it comes down to certain artistic endeavors, you can have native inspired, and then there are authentic native crafts. And among those things that are authentically native, there are some things that have a sacred a connection, a sacred, they are of a sacred nature, and they should only be made by the individuals that understand that and have, and whose heritage shows that that is part of who they are. But there are many art forms where, you know, artists are inspired by many different things and many common things. And so as long as, and there are laws in the United States that actually mandate that anything that is made by someone who is not indigenous, not a member of, a citizen of a tribe that is recognized either at the federal or state level, that they're not allowed to call it an authentic native item. They can say it's native inspired. And I think that that's appropriate. As long as it doesn't cross the line into those items that are sacred. I don't know the story of the Wampanoag sinkhole, so I don't know if that's a sacred thing or not. It would take a Wampanoag, I guess, to tell you.
Trinity?
I have had the opportunity to work with many different artists who use many different mediums. And I think it is lovely that people are inspired by Native culture and Native values and principles. I think that, you know, we were talking about appreciation of and appropriation versus misappropriation. I think that is appreciating the culture if you are recognizing that it is coming from a Native culture. And I think that it creates a bigger bridge between Native culture and more modern things, I'll say. As a young person, most of my young life, I felt like I was living in between two worlds. You know, my school career and, you know, my non-Native friends was completely separate from who I was as an Indigenous person. So when I get to participate or see things that show that people who are non-Indigenous appreciate my culture, it makes me feel like those two worlds are coming together. And it's a blessing to me. As long as it is appreciated and recognized that it's not their culture, and it is not something that they are taking, you know, they are taking and making light of a ceremonial piece. Actually, I was just last week, I worked with a writer who wrote a story about living in the Delaware area and being by the water and figuring out a connection to Lenape history. He's not an Indigenous person, but he recognized the importance of recognizing the people who were on that land before all those buildings were there. And it was a wonderful experience, and it opened everyone else's mind to recognizing that that was Lenape territory. So I think it can be a great tool if it is done appropriately.
Up here in Canada, we have a review that's done every couple of years on the copyright law. And they found out that there was a magazine research study done in Vancouver, city of Vancouver, where they found 75% of the artifacts and what was being sold in the novelty stores were not made. They were supposedly native items, native like dream catchers, etc. They were not made by native people. Native people had nothing to do with them. In fact, a lot of them came over from China.
Oh.
So that copyright law is not protecting Indigenous art, Indigenous expression, Indigenous stories. And so that's something that we're going to have to change and seek legal remedy in order to accomplish. So that's something that's on our agenda up here in Canada. I liked what the Reverend was saying about how there's a law that says non-Indigenous people cannot be making Indigenous arts and crafts. I know that there was something similar to that up here in Canada, but it wasn't enforceable. So, people are still doing it, and it's still quite prevalent. So it's something that we're working on.
I'm always telling people, because we're on the radio and we do announcements about what's happening in the area, and generally in the summer there's powwows all over the place. And I'm always encouraging people to go out there, in June, July, and August and September, and do your Christmas shopping, So when you're going out to the reserve, to the powwow, the vendors have to prove to the committee that they are Native. Usually they have to show a status card. And if they don't have a status card, then they can't set up their tables. So when the people head out to the powwows, they get authentic Native American products. So I'm certain there may be sacred ceremonial items sold there. Like one time I bought Dan a little water drum, but that's not available to everybody. People kind of have that sitting way in the back someplace, and you have to kind of ask around for those kind of things.
Well, would it be inappropriate then for a non-native to purchase this drum and play it?
What do you think?
Well,
It sounds like whoever has the money could buy the drum, and I'm wondering, that is part of the issue that I think is affecting this questioner.
Yeah, it's not something that's really monitored on the powwow grounds. It's not something that's kind of policed. It's kind of something that the people see it, and it's not a real water drum. It's like a water drum that's made of fiberglass, but it's similar to a water drum in many respects. A real water drum is made a certain way of making them, and with everything very specific. And so those water drums are very much, in fact, ceremonial artifacts that would not be for sale at a powwow.
So I think in my reading, and I'm going to ask for your thoughts on this, that it is, if you're thinking about getting a sweater because you like a particular pattern that is native pattern, would it not be better to buy an Indian produced, say a Navajo rug rather than a Navajo inspired rug, so as to support and appreciate both the culture and the people who have a tradition of making patterns that have a particular meaning. So rather than buy Indian inspired articles, to buy the genuine article as produced by Native peoples. That could be a rule of thumb.
Yes, there was a situation out in Cowichan Valley, out on Vancouver Island, where the Cowichan sweaters are very famous. And there was a store on the mainland of British Columbia that was selling Cowichan inspired sweaters. And so they found that was some kind of an infringement, not a copyright infringement, but it was an infringement of cultural appropriation. And so the store was embarrassed enough and shamed enough that they stopped selling that particular Cowichan inspired sweater. And the Cowichan are now the only ones producing that sweater.
And hopefully the Native artists are also selling them.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Frida, you had your hand up, I think, and maybe Trinity did too. I was quick. Go ahead.
Well, I traveled to Alaska in British Columbia a few years ago. And during that travel, I discovered that the Tlingit would adopt a person who has a Caucasian background. And because in the village of Haines, there was this whole like a theater where you could go as a traveler and see a story told on stage about their culture. And there were natives in the production, but the person who was running it was basically a white man who had gotten himself adopted. And he's the one who was running the show. I went into Seattle, and the Haida have these wonderful raven masks that they wear, and they can make the clicking noises that ravens make, and it's part of ceremony. And there they were in the art shows, in the art stores, beautifully done, very much like what Haida would have as their own. But the person who made it was an adopted Tlingit artist. So in other words, this is one way to get past the law, is to get yourself adopted and then call yourself that, and then go ahead and make these items and sell them. So see, I didn't feel good about that. And probably others don't either, because it was a way for them to sell art and then call it, their own, and call it Tlingit. But they were not part of the, they were in Seattle.
But they were adopted by the.
It's important because you have, that's what they say, but the responsibility, where's the responsibility to that? With us, knowledge is always connected to responsibility.
Well, here's a question to follow up. It seems to me if they were adopted by the tribe, then the tribe has taken responsibility for their actions, and that person is accountable to the tribe. And hence, your feeling as an Onondaga person versus the Tlingit ought to predominate in the Tlingit territory, should it not, based on what we said earlier?
And the artwork, yeah. And also, I really didn't have the feeling that the nation adopted them. I felt like an individual said, "You're my son now," or something. It did not feel like a real thing. But I didn't have a good feeling about it. That's all I got to say.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to a question about identity that I thought was an interesting one. Very early in our webinar series, I got an email from a gentleman who his great-great-grandmother was Potawatomi, and he says, because of this history, the current members of the Potawatomi tribe have predominantly European blood. The Commonwealth of Virginia recognizes the tribe. The U.S. government does not yet. Is it appropriation for a collection of people who have verified ancestral connections to the original tribe but have a predominantly European ancestry to represent themselves as Native Americans? I think we're all familiar with the situation with Senator Warren, but claiming Native identity. Do you have thoughts about that?
There's a difference between claiming that you have some Native ancestry and claiming that you are Native. And I think it was Vine Deloria that in one of his works said that being Native is not as much about what you claim, but about who claims you. And that if you have a continuing community that has been in existence, a Native community that has been in existence since before the time of contact, that has continued to self-identify, has continued to stay in community historically throughout that history, that is a Native community. Now, there may be admixture. There's admixture, for tribes that are first contact on the coasts. There's admixture for many tribes that are in the inner part of the continent. But if the community, the core of the community has continued, And one of the marks, at least for where we are here on the East Coast, is that Native communities are interrelated. They're families that have identified and are interrelated and for centuries. If that's the case, then it is a historic Native community. And the people in that community are Native. They may have admixture, but they are Native. If, however, you're talking about the fact that you have a group of people that did a DNA search and suddenly discovered that they're Native and then came together, well, without any sense of ongoing community or historic connection, then that may be, a cultural appreciation society. That may be an organization of individuals who are claiming some Native heritage, but that's not a nation or tribe. That's a cultural appreciation society or heritage group. Now, if this tribe has been acknowledged by the state, I'm assuming that they've certified some history. That's an assumption on my part. So their admixture is not necessarily something that that other tribes should question.
So in this particular case where the Potawatomi tribe is recognized by the state, and obviously to do that has to have had a continuous ongoing organization and governance and so forth to attain state recognition. Obviously it has that.
That should be the case.
Then they would be the determinants. Then they would be the determiners of whether that person could claim to be of Potawatomi.
In the United States, tribes make their own rules for their own citizenship. And some tribes are lineal descent, meaning that as long as you can prove that you are descended from their historic roles, you may be eligible for membership. Others are by blood quantum. You have to have a certain percentage of the ancestry from that core historic group. Some have various combinations of the two. Some include contact, that you have to have been born within the community and not just simply be able to certify ancestry. Every tribe as a sovereign makes its own rules for citizenship.
Thank you. Have I missed a hand from Frida and Trinity? And if so, do you have comments on this particular point? Or on one that we raised a while back that you didn't get to express?
I think I just had a slight point when you said that the state, we don't know how the state recognized them. We don't know what they considered. What Pastor Norwood said were good points, but we don't know the state did that.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar. I'm unfamiliar with that community. I don't know what the requirements are in Virginia. I do know that there are tribes in Virginia that were historically recognized from colonial times, and many of which have recently, within the past 5 years or so, also gotten on the federal list. But it was known across Indian country that these people were Native. They were people of first contact. And although I'm unfamiliar with that particular tribe.
Thank you. One comment, one question is, excuse me, I have to scroll to get these. I know that tobacco is often given as an offering in various settings among Indigenous peoples. Is it and I think this may depend on context, and you can help clarify this. Is it appropriate for non-Indigenous people to make offerings of tobacco?
It's been done.
Yeah.
Well, we certainly know that.
I have, if a non-Native person is invited to participate in a ceremony led and approved by a Native community, and is done in the traditions of that community, then yes. If a non-Native person is taking tobacco and leading a ceremony and claiming it's a Native ceremony, then that's a whole different thing. And you know, I would personally disagree with that. But my tribe has had had ceremonies that they've invited friends of the tribe to, people that have been embraced by the tribe and supported the tribe. And you know, Mr. Meyer, that that we have a 350, 370 year history with the Quaker community here. So many Quakers are welcome into our community and embraced in the midst of certain ceremonies. They're allowed to offer tobacco in the fire and as a blessing. But those are native-led ceremonies. And I think that that's the distinction.
Also, it's often given, tobacco is given for an appreciation that you came to an event or that you're sharing knowledge. So they bring tobacco because they understood it's the thing to do. It's not offensive in that sense.
I think some of us have actually been encouraged to make an offering of, and I think maybe offering is a word that has got mixed messages, say to give a gift of tobacco to an elder, either when asking a favor of an Indigenous person or in recognition of gratitude for having performed a favor for a non-native person, to give that to the native person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's what I was going to mention. A couple of years ago, I participated in a celebration where they put a marker on the shore in Philadelphia, signifying where one of the last slave ship to ever reach the shores of Philadelphia. And I came and I participated, and the host of the event gave me tobacco as a gift. And I accepted it, and I thought it was wonderful. It was her meeting me at my shore. You know, she understood who I was as an Indigenous person. She did her research to make sure that she was honoring me in my custom, which I think is a great example of appreciation and not misappropriation. So often as Indigenous people, we have to meet everyone else wherever they are. Mm-hmm. And the best way to appreciate a culture is to meet it where it is and respect it where it is, and not, you know, manipulating it and making it what makes you feel good or satisfied.
Thank you. I think maybe we could turn to a question that I think is on many people's minds as we are dealing with masketry, and we may have more of this coming up in our subsequent workshops that will follow in the new year, building on our webinars this fall. Certainly with the Washington NFL team, and if you've read any of the articles suggested by Pastor Norwood on the Boy Scouts of America, the Order of the Arrow, the question is, what do you say to non-native organizations that have long-standing practices that appropriate elements of native culture, sometimes mixed with multiple native cultures, that they claim are honoring of the culture or cultures?
I don't know much about what the Boy Scouts do. Can anyone fill us in the kind of things that they do?
Well, I could. Briefly, I could say that I am still a member of the Order of the Arrow, which purported to be based on a Lenape tradition. So when I moved to Pennsylvania, I already had heard of the Lenni Lenape, but I have heard it through misinterpreted, non-historical eyes, and that this is an honorary society of the Boy Scouts of America.
Yeah.
But the articles that were suggested do elaborate more on this. I would say that since the very early 1900s, there has been various ways of mischaracterizing and appropriating native things, cultures, and artifacts inappropriately because Indian culture was pronounced dead, whereas we know that's not true. But it was kind of, well, I'll let Pastor Norwood or one of the others speak more appropriately about that. But there's a tradition of building on what is a supposed native culture that had much to do with the erasure and the deliberate cultural genocide of native peoples that make appropriation itself all the more offensive.
And I don't want to kick the Boy Scouts. I think that you know, that's an honorable organization. Over time, it has made major contributions. We have volunteers from Scouting that have participated and supported our tribe in many ways. But there is a difference between being supportive and appreciating the tribal heritage and misappropriating. When ceremonies are concocted and people put on dress and play Indian in these ceremonies, that's offensive. And it's something that if you read some of the lore based on things that I have been exposed to, the lore they're concocted stories. Some of them are based more on James Fenwick Cooper, I believe, The Last of the Mohicans, which, you know, the book itself was a lie because we have Mohicans still. And some of the names were not even Lenape names, although they had Algonquian roots in some of the lore. So it was really a concocted thing. There was also a claim that he had been given these ceremonies by some chief or elder, the person that originated these ceremonies. And as I said before, those are things that I can't imagine would have been done. But even if someone had, those ceremonies belong to the community and not to a single individual. And to hand it over to an organization, I think, especially at a time when our people were being persecuted for doing them, is highly unlikely. So I was brought in to an organization that was not a Scouting organization, but similar to the Scouts. They had rituals that were purported to be Native-like. And they were using ceremonial items in their rituals at this campground. And I was asked to come in and take a look and to give my opinion. And they were very open with, you know, and willing to listen. And what I advised them to do was to appreciate the values, but have designed their own, you know, promotional ceremonies and everything that were unique to their organization and their organization's history, maybe, you know, referencing the values that they cherished from the indigenous culture, but not appropriating or misappropriating the ceremonies themselves or concocting something that they claimed was a native ceremony. When I entered the area, they actually had masks that looked very similar to sacred masks that our people use in the Northeast, and this particular one looked very much like something that was part of Lenape culture, and I told them that was inappropriate. And so if you work with the local organization, you know, that's interested, if tribes are willing to talk with them, sometimes they will listen. And I have seen, we've had Boy Scout organizations contact our tribe wanting to learn our songs, wanting to learn how to make our regalia. And most of our people, especially our elders, are very much against that. They have a problem with it. Trinity can speak for the younger ones, but I know that those of us with gray hair aren't too happy with it.
Maybe that's a good idea.
Oh, well, the young folk aren't too happy about it either. You know, for most of the last century, our ceremonies and our language and who we were as people was illegal. So then for people to turn around and decide it's theirs now is a spit in the face, you know, and it perpetuates erasure. It can't be ours. It has to be taken away from us. So it is an emotionally charging thing, you know, and on top of that, you know, our regalia, our crafts, our ceremonies, our language, they are an extension of who we are. It's not something we just do for fun because we're in the mood. You know, we live those things every day. It's not something we take lightly. When my father made me regalia, he prayed over it. When I put it on, I pray over it. It is my connection to him, to my ancestors, to the creator. It is so much deeper than that. So to see somebody put it on for fun, it is heartbreaking to an Indigenous person. It is my connection to everything. A couple years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Carlisle, which is one of the few Indian boarding schools on the East Coast, and the theme or the motto of that school was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And you know, for children to have been ripped away from their culture for hundreds of years, you know, we have people in our community and many other Indigenous communities that have a living memory of boarding schools where they weren't able to speak their language or share their culture. So it's important to us, and it is what we have to hold on to. And for other people to decide that it is so insignificant that you can just throw it on whenever you feel like it and throw it off, you know, it erases who I am as an Indigenous person.
Thank you.
Well,
I am thinking that we are, oh, go ahead, Dan. I'm thinking that we are very close to the end, and I want to save time for a closing comments from each of the panelists. So if you could keep your remarks a little bit brief on this topic, and then we'll have closing thoughts from each of the panelists. Unless you'd like to turn this into your closing thought.
You know, I just wanted to, on what Trinity was saying about Carlisle's slogan, motto, that was a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who was a minister of Sir John A. Macdonald up here in Canada. And he said that this is how we are going to solve the Indian problem. And the Indian problem is going to be solved by killing the Indian and saving the man, saving the boy. And so that was the advent of residential schools, because they were the ones who were the architects of residential schools and all the damage, cultural damage, collateral damage that was left in the wake of residential schools, boarding schools as they're known down in the United States.
Thank you.
That's a whole other seminar.
It is. We are going to be learning something about that further. It was a topic in our initial conference, and Alicia Goodsoldier and her daughter, Conte, will be speaking to us about that on October 12th, and on the healing processes that Indigenous peoples are undertaking for their own healing from this incredible part of that version of the genocide that we've seen in this country and in Canada. Could we have closing remarks? Frida, would you lead us off with any thoughts? I know that you had talked initially about belonging and the importance of relationship in these questions that we are addressing on appreciation and appropriation.
Yes, I think the word is responsibility. When we have knowledge, there's always responsibility with knowledge. So I had an example of a person who gathered information from different nations. She didn't necessarily share them wrong, in a sense of she didn't lie about what she learned, but there was no connection with any of those communities. So there was no responsibility carried by her about how she was sharing it. And also, when someone grabs things from here and there, their knowledge will be just minimal. And maybe there's a very important aspect that they may be missing. So when you're speaking approached by someone, or you're approaching someone to get knowledge from, consider their connection with their community. And, you know, how long they've been teaching, and are they connected to their community? Because you learn as you go what you can share, how much you can share, and what's respectful to share. Okay.
Thank you, Frida.
You're welcome.
Dan and Mary Lou, would you care to give us closing thoughts?
Well, I'd like to say that I really appreciated this past little while that we've spent together sharing some of our ideas. We need to have more gatherings like this, because people have to be told about different things that they're doing wrong. And people have to be able to learn about things that our elders saved for us to know. When I was 17 years old, I went out to ecumenical conference in Morley, Alberta. And it was one of the first times that the elders brought out their medicines and their bundles of the drums. Yeah, the pipes were wrapped in bundled blankets, and they brought the drums out. And it was the first time that they shared with the non-native clergy of the world to show them that our way is as legitimate as their way. We only have a different way of doing things. So I learned back then that our elders kept those ceremonies and teachings alive when we had Indian agents keeping us on the reserve. Our elders went way back in the bush, and there's still evidence being found today that they traveled a mile or two back in the bush to have a fire in the middle of the night when the Indian agent was sleeping. And they did those ceremonies, they did the sweat lodge ceremonies, and they were yelling and whooping and singing, and they kept those ceremonies alive for us. So we have to let the people know about that, and we have to let them know about the proper protocols. So I really appreciate being a part of this panel, and I wish you all well.
Yes, I would just like to add that I think a lot of it also is representation, how we're represented. And I think we have to take responsibility, as Frida said, for how we are represented. Because I know that for too long, they have been representing us, and they have gotten it wrong. So it's now time for us to tell our own story. It's time for us to be heard. It's time for them to listen. And I think that's happening. And that's the beauty. The arts are just exploding, because we're going through a renaissance where we're finding our voice. I think it was Louis Riel, one of our Métis leaders, who said back before he was hung for treason, he said around 1876, 77, he said, "My people will sleep for 100 years, and it will be the artists who will be waking them up." And sure enough, about 1860, 1870, or 1960, 1970, our artists could not hang their art in galleries because we were considered a dying people. We were considered extinct. Our population was similar at the beginning of 20th century, was about the same as the buffalo, population of the buffalo. And the buffalo were considered extinct. So that tells you that that's how society was looking upon us. So when the artists began to say, well, our art doesn't belong in museums, it's going to be hung. And if you won't let us hang our art in your galleries, then we're going to open up our own galleries and we're going to hang our art there. And that's what we began to do. Slowly but surely, more and more of the artists are starting to be heard now. We have a gathering that we had here in London called the Gathering of the Good Mind, and artists and elders. So I think representation, it's our turn. So we're taking it. Nyaweh, miigwech, all my relations.
Thank you very much for being with us and sharing all that you have with us. Pastor Norwood, would you care to make a closing statement or observation, something crystalline that we just can take away as we have heard so much this evening?
only that there is a difference between appreciating and misappropriating. And that when you appreciate, you're acknowledging that the art or the story or the song is not yours. It belongs to another culture. And how the local indigenous people view how it should be handled, when you travel into their territory, is how you should respect their wishes. And also that the perpetuation of these things, that the perpetuation of the culture is the responsibility of the people for whom it is their heritage. And how it is handled has to be determined by them. And I also want to thank you for inviting me to participate. Wanishi.
Wanishi.
Manishi.
Trinity, you've let your elders speak first, but you have the last word.
Well, I want to say thank you to my elders. It is always an honor to hear you speak, and I've taken away so much from your words. It was a blessing for me. I want to say thank you, Mr. Meyer. This has been a wonderful experience. I hope everybody takes away something from this, and I hope it also planted a seed in your mind or your heart to do a little bit more digging and a little bit more learning.
Thank you all very much. I so appreciate your time, your sharing of your knowledge, your perspective, your traditions, and helping us non-native people to set a straight course and appreciate all of the indigenous cultures with which we may come in contact, encouraging us to establish relationships respectfully. And I'm just very, very grateful for you being with us. And I'm very grateful for all of you who have come to this webinar this evening for being with us. We hope you will join us next week for a small group discussions where we'll break you into small discussion groups with some queries, and hopefully that will make this more of a learning experience as we share our experiences of the past 3 webinars among the participants who have been there. All are welcome. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Oh.
Only